other historical books. The Pentateuch records the birth of God's people. The account continues in the second section of the canon, known as the historical books. These books are important, first of all, because of their historical content. They covered a period of time at least 800 years in length, from Joshua's conquest to the Persian Empire in which Esther lived. The historical books begin with Joshua, which describes Israel's conquest of the Promised Land. Then Judges and Ruth tell of the period before Israel had kings, when judges ruled the people. The books of Samuel and Kings cover the period of the monarchy. The United Kingdom of Saul, David, and Solomon was eventually divided into Israel in the north and Judah in the south. Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah retell the history from a later historical perspective and continue the narration into the post-exilic restoration. Esther illustrates the role of God's people under Persian rule. Besides their historical worth, these books are also important for what they teach theologically. They are more than history or a record of mere historical facts. They trace the history of God's relationship with His nation, revealing His faithfulness and steadfast love for His people, even when they broke covenant. These are important events to learn from, not merely about. Then what are the historical books about? The book of Joshua was written to show the surpassing value of obedience. It paints the picture of Israel's successful conquest of the Promised Land, highlighting the importance of absolute commitments to God's word and dependence on His power. Judges, on the other hand, relates the almost hopeless state of Israel after the conquest. The nation fell victim to religious compromise. Israel seemed incapable of sustained periods of obedience to God's will and doomed to failure. Temporary periods of obedience brought peace and success, but each time the nation fell back into sin. The book of Judges was written to vindicate Israel's need for a king. Ruth is inserted after the book of Judges because the events detailed in it took place during the Judges period. This little book illustrates God's sovereign care for faithful individuals who live in the midst of national religious apostasy. God used the faithfulness of a single family to work a miracle and to provide Israel's greatest king, that is David. The books of Samuel trace the early history of Israel's monarchy. Samuel was a prophet and judge who led Israel through the transition from judges to kings. The books tell the story of Israel's first two kings, that is Saul and David. 2 Samuel is especially devoted to describing the major events of David's kingship. The book of Kings details the history of the monarchy from Solomon to the fall of Jerusalem. They contrast obedience with disobedience in order to illustrate the result of both. Things went well for Solomon initially, but his failure to remain faithful to Yahweh resulted in a divided kingdom, that is, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. Northern Israel was religiously apostate from the start and fell to the Assyrians in 722 BC. Judah vacillated between evil kings and a few good ones, until the wickedness of certain kings was too great. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, took Jerusalem in 586 BC. The rest of the historical books come from post-exilic period. The books of Chronicles serve as the first commentary on the scriptures. These books retell the stories of David, Solomon, and the kingdom of Judah, which are the accounts already known from the books of Samuel and Kings. But the author of the Chronicles was not simply repeating old news. He highlighted God's work among his people through David's line. This author desired to follow a strict line of faith and salvation without detours into the failures of the past. His audience in the exile knew all too well the story of the national moral collapse and defeat. His generation needed to be reminded of the victories of Israel's heritage as a means of providing hope for the future. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah were probably written together as one composition. They present the events of the restoration in the middle of the 5th century BC. Under Persian rule, the Jews living in Babylonia were allowed to return to their homeland to rebuild. The able leadership of Ezra and Nehemiah helped the Jewish people rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. These books also relate the rebuilding of the social and religious foundations of God's people. The fascinating little book of Esther demonstrates how God's sovereign care and protection extend to his people, even while they are living in Persian exile. The book is a historical short story about Queen Esther and her cousin Mordecai. Unlike any other biblical book, Esther shows that even when God is silent, he is at work fulfilling his promises to his people. Now we need to take a look at what Jewish canon call former prophets. All the books mentioned above are the historical books in our Christian canon. It is noteworthy that the Jewish canon calls Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings the former prophets. How can this be an appropriate designation for these books? They are regarded as former prophets in Jewish canon because they relate the early history of prophecy and write the national history of Israel in light of theological and prophetical interests. I hope the quick overview of the historical books give you a bird's eye understanding of this section in the Old Testament.